I am Ethel Harper, 27 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew what family meant. My grandparents raised me more than my own parents did, teaching me values that shaped my entire life. When they passed away within months of each other, I was devastated. What I never expected was that their death would reveal an $18 million inheritance that would turn my own parents into strangers I no longer recognized. Before I share how my own parents tried to steal my inheritance, let me know where you are watching from, and hit the subscribe button if you have ever had to stand up against your own family. Growing up, my relationship with my grandparents, Eleanor and William Harper, was the foundation of my childhood. While most kids spent weekends at the mall or playing sports, I spent mine in my grandparents' cozy Victorian home on Maple Street, helping Grandma Eleanor bake her famous apple pies, or listening to Grandpa William's stories about his time as a young engineer. My parents, Jennifer and Robert Harper, were always distant figures in my life. They were successful corporate executives who traveled constantly. Their career ambitions meant I spent more time with my grandparents than with them. From kindergarten until high school, I would often stay at my grandparents' house for weeks at a time, while my parents jetted off to conferences in Tokyo, London, or Sydney. "Your parents are building something important," Grandma Eleanor would tell me whenever she saw my disappointment when they missed another school play or birthday. "But while they're away, we get to have our special time together." She always knew how to make me feel cherished rather than abandoned. My grandparents never seemed wealthy. They lived modestly in the same house they had purchased 40 years ago. Grandpa drove the same Ford pickup truck for 15 years, and Grandma darned socks rather than buying new ones. "Waste not, want not," was one of her favorite sayings. They taught me the value of saving, of taking care of what you have, and of finding joy in simple pleasures. Every summer, we had a tradition of camping by Lake Champlain. We would spend days fishing, hiking, and telling stories around the campfire. Grandpa taught me how to identify constellations, how to build a proper fire, and how to track animals in the forest. Grandma taught me how to cook over an open flame, how to identify medicinal plants, and how to find north without a compass. These weren't just fun activities. They were life lessons about self-reliance and appreciation for the natural world. When I turned 18, my parents expected me to study business or law, something practical that would lead to a high-paying career like theirs. But my grandparents encouraged me to follow my passion for environmental science. "Education is never wasted," Grandpa would say. "Learn what makes your heart full, and the rest will follow." With their emotional support, I attended college for environmental conservation, a choice that disappointed my parents but made me genuinely happy. My parents' values always revolved around status and material success. They lived in a luxurious penthouse apartment, drove expensive cars, and took lavish vacations. Their conversations revolved around investments, property values, and career advancements. In contrast, my grandparents talked about community, nature, books they were reading, and the importance of character. "A good name is worth more than gold," Grandpa would often remind me. It wasn't until much later that I realized how deeply they lived by this principle, even when it came to their own wealth. Throughout my childhood and early adulthood, I had no idea my grandparents had accumulated significant wealth. They never spoke about money, except to teach practical lessons about saving and avoiding debt. Looking back, there were subtle clues: their extensive but modest charitable giving, the fact that they paid for my college education without any apparent strain, and the way other elderly people in town seemed to respect them for more than just their age. After college, I took a job with a conservation nonprofit in the same town, working to protect local watersheds. My parents viewed my career choice with barely disguised disappointment. "With your education, you could be making 6 figures at an environmental consulting firm," my father would say during our infrequent phone calls. Meanwhile, my grandparents attended every community event where I spoke, beaming with pride at my work. When Grandma was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 3 years ago, I didn't hesitate to move back into their home to help care for her. My parents suggested hiring a nurse instead, offering to pay for it so I could focus on advancing my career. But I refused. Those final years with my grandparents were precious beyond measure, filled with deeper conversations and stronger bonds as we faced her declining health together. Grandpa and I developed a routine. Every morning, we would help Grandma with her exercises, then have breakfast together. I would go to work, coming home during lunch to check on them. In the evenings, we would sit on their wraparound porch, watching the sunset. Grandpa would hold Grandma's increasingly trembling hand, and they would reminisce about their 62 years of marriage. "Take care of each other," Grandma often said to me during those sunset conversations. "In the end, how you treat people is all that matters." I thought she was speaking generally about life philosophy. I had no idea she was preparing me for what would come after they were gone. The day Grandma Eleanor passed away was gray and rainy, fitting for the heaviness in my heart. She went peacefully in her sleep, after a particularly good day where she had been lucid and talkative. We had looked through old photo albums, and she had told stories about her childhood that I had never heard before. It felt like a gift, that final day of clarity, before she slipped away forever. Grandpa William was stoic at the funeral, standing tall despite his 84 years. He greeted each mourner with dignity and grace, thanking them for coming to celebrate Eleanor's life. My parents flew in from a business trip in California, arriving just 2 hours before the service. They stood awkwardly at the reception, accepting condolences from people who knew my grandparents far better than they did. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," my mother said stiffly, as we drove back to the house afterward. It struck me as such a formal thing to say about her own mother, highlighting the emotional distance that had always existed in our family. What none of us expected was how quickly Grandpa would follow Grandma. Just 3 months later, he passed away in his armchair, a book of poetry open on his lap. The doctor said it was heart failure, but everyone who knew them said he died of a broken heart. They had rarely spent a day apart in over 6 decades of marriage. His funeral was smaller, but no less emotional. Again, my parents flew in, this time from New York, where they had been closing a business deal. They seemed genuinely sad, but also slightly impatient, checking their phones frequently during the service. I overheard my father telling someone they would need to fly out again the next morning. The day after the funeral, we gathered at the house for a small family reception. My uncle Timothy, my father's brother, was there with his wife and 2 teenage children. A few cousins from my mother's side also attended. There was an uncomfortable undercurrent to the gathering, a sense of expectation hovering in the air. "So," my Uncle Timothy said during an awkward pause in conversation, "I suppose we'll be meeting with the lawyers soon to discuss the estate?" He glanced meaningfully at my father, who nodded. "I have already called Harold Jenkins," my father said. "He was their attorney for decades. We are meeting him tomorrow morning." I was surprised they had arranged this without consulting me, but I was too emotionally drained to object. The next morning, we all drove to a modest office building downtown, where Harold Jenkins had his law practice. He was an elderly man with kind eyes and a formal manner, dressed in a meticulously pressed suit despite the summer heat. Harold's office was like stepping back in time, with dark wood paneling, leather-bound books lining the walls, and a heavy antique desk that dominated the room. He greeted each of us by name, offering his condolences before getting down to business. "I worked with William and Eleanor Harper for over 40 years, he began, adjusting his glasses. They were thoughtful, deliberate people who knew exactly what they wanted. He opened a folder and removed a thick document. "This is their last will and testament, updated just 6 months ago, before Eleanor's health began to significantly decline." He cleared his throat and began to read. The first few minutes covered standard legal language, and I found my mind wandering to memories of my grandparents. Then Harold said something that snapped me back to attention. "To our beloved granddaughter, Ethel Harper, we leave our entire estate, including all financial assets, properties, and personal belongings." The room went completely silent. I looked up to see everyone staring at me. My father's face had gone pale, while my mother's had flushed red. Uncle Timothy's mouth was literally hanging open. There must be some mistake, my father said finally, his voice tight. Harold shook his head. There is no mistake. William and Eleanor were extremely clear about their wishes. He turned a page. The estate includes their home and property, valued at approximately $2 million, investment accounts and stocks valued at approximately $15.5 million, and personal property valued at approximately $500,000. I felt lightheaded. $18 million. It was an incomprehensible amount. My grandparents, who darned socks and drove old trucks, had quietly amassed a fortune. They also left this letter for you, Ethel, Harold said, handing me an envelope with my name written in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read silently. Dearest Ethel, if you are reading this, both Eleanor and I have moved on from this life. Do not grieve too long for us. We lived full and happy lives, and having you in them was one of our greatest joys. You may be surprised by our decision to leave everything to you. Over the years, we watched you grow into a person of integrity and compassion. While others in the family pursued wealth for its own sake, you pursued purpose and meaning. You chose to care for us in our final years, not out of obligation, but out of love. We accumulated this wealth slowly and carefully over many decades through wise investments and simple living. We never spoke of it because we wanted our family to value what truly matters: character, kindness, and connection. Sadly, we watched as your parents became increasingly focused on status and material success, values we do not share. We trust you to use this inheritance wisely, in ways that reflect the values we tried to instill in you. You do not need to share it, though you may choose to do so as your heart directs. This is your inheritance, not family property to be divided or controlled by others. With all our love and confidence in you, Grandpa William and Grandma Eleanor. Tears streamed down my face as I finished reading. The letter confirmed what I had always felt, that my grandparents and I shared a special bond based on aligned values and genuine love. This is outrageous, my mother said, her voice rising. We are their children. How could they cut us out completely? Harold remained calm. They did not make this decision lightly, Mrs. Harper. They discussed their reasoning with me at length. We will contest this, my father announced, standing abruptly. Clearly, they were not of sound mind. You are welcome to try, Harold replied evenly, but I can assure you that William and Eleanor were meticulously thorough in documenting their mental competence. They underwent psychological evaluations, specifically to prevent such challenges. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. Then, without another word, they walked out, leaving me alone with Harold Jenkins and a mountain of questions. Take some time to process all this, Ethel, Harold said kindly. There is no rush to make any decisions. The house is yours now, and everything in it. Your grandparents trusted you completely. As I left his office, I felt both overwhelmed by responsibility and strangely validated by my grandparents' faith in me. I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. 3 days after the meeting with Harold Jenkins, my parents invited me to dinner at their hotel suite. They had extended their stay, postponing their return to New York indefinitely. When I arrived, I found they had ordered an elaborate meal from room service, with wine that I knew cost hundreds of dollars per bottle. Sit down, Ethel, my father said, gesturing to the elegantly set table. His tone was conciliatory, almost warm, a stark contrast to the cold fury he had displayed in the lawyer's office. We have had some time to think, and we want to discuss the situation like adults. I sat cautiously, accepting a glass of water instead of wine. My mother smiled at me, but the smile did not reach her eyes. We were shocked by your grandparents' decision, she began, but we understand they were very fond of you, and we recognize that you took good care of them in their final years, my father added, slicing into his steak. That deserves acknowledgement. Their sudden change in tone made me uneasy. This was not the angry confrontation I had been bracing for, but something more calculated. That said, my father continued, setting down his knife and fork, $18 million is a significant responsibility. Managing that kind of wealth requires expertise and experience that, frankly, you simply do not have at your age. What your father is saying, my mother interjected, is that we should approach this as a family. Family money should stay with family decision makers. I have 25 years of experience in investment banking, my father said, leaning forward. I could grow that 18 million into 30 million within 5 years, with the right strategy. I took a sip of water, considering my response carefully. I appreciate your concern, but Grandma and Grandpa were clear about their wishes. I plan to honor them. My father's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his pleasant expression. Ethel, there is something you should know. Your mother and I have been facing some financial challenges recently. This was news to me. My parents had always projected an image of immense success. They lived in a luxury apartment, wore designer clothes, and took exotic vacations multiple times a year. The economic downturn hit some of our investments hard, my mother explained. We have significant loans that are coming due. We always planned to ask your grandparents for assistance, but then Eleanor got sick, and it never seemed like the right time. The implication was clear. They expected me to bail them out. But something about their story did not add up. We are not asking for charity, my father clarified quickly. Just a partnership. You transfer the assets to a family trust that we manage together, with my expertise guiding the investments. And naturally, a portion would help us resolve our current situation, my mother added. I thought about my grandparents' letter, about their careful observations of my parents' values. How much do you owe? I asked directly. My parents exchanged a glance. About 4 million, my father admitted. But that is not the point. The point is that you are 27 years old with no financial background. Do you really think you can manage $18 million without making catastrophic mistakes? His condescending tone sparked something in me. All my life, my parents had dismissed my choices, my education, my career, my values. Now they were dismissing my ability to honor my grandparents' explicit wishes. I may not have your financial expertise, I said carefully, but I have Harold Jenkins to advise me, and I can hire financial managers who will respect my wishes instead of pushing their own agenda. My father's pleasant facade cracked. This is absurd. We are your parents. That money should be under family control, our control. It is under family control, I replied. Mine. My mother's face hardened. You have no idea the sacrifices we made for you. While you were having fun baking cookies with your grandmother, we were working 60-hour weeks to provide for this family. To provide what? I asked, genuinely curious. You were rarely present in my life. Grandma and Grandpa raised me more than you did. It was as if I had slapped her. How dare you? We gave you everything. The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there. My father revealed that they had borrowed extensively from my grandparents over the years, loans that had been forgiven in the will. It became clear that their successful lifestyle had been partially funded by my grandparents all along. Your grandparents always intended for that money to stay with the primary family line, my father insisted. They would never have wanted you to exclude us like this. That is not what their letter said, I countered, thinking of the careful wording about values and choices. My mother's voice turned tearful. After all we have done for you, this is how you repay us? By hoarding your grandparents' fortune while your own parents struggle? I felt a stab of guilt, quickly followed by anger at the manipulation. I need time to think, I said, standing up. This is all still very new. My father's expression turned cold. Do not take too long. Family loyalty only stretches so far, Ethel. Either you work with us on this, or you are on your own. I left the hotel with my hands shaking, tears threatening to spill over. For the first time, I was seeing my parents clearly, not as the successful, busy professionals who had simply been too occupied to be present in my life, but as manipulative people who viewed relationships in terms of financial transactions. As I drove back to what was now my house, I realized the dinner had not been a reconciliation attempt, but the opening move in what would become a painful battle for my grandparents' legacy. The 2 weeks following that disastrous dinner were a masterclass in psychological warfare. It began with hourly phone calls from both parents, alternating between guilt trips, veiled threats, and occasional moments of apparent reconciliation that would dissolve into demands as soon as I showed any receptiveness. "We only want what is best for the family," my mother would say sweetly, before adding, "Your grandparents would be so disappointed to see how selfish you have become." My father took a different approach. "You realize we could challenge the will on grounds of undue influence," he told me during one call. "It would tie up every penny in legal battles for years." Nobody wins in that scenario, Ethel. I began to screen my calls, which only escalated their tactics. 3 days after the dinner, my Uncle Timothy called me. "Your father tells me you are refusing to help them, despite their financial troubles," he said, his tone heavy with disapproval. Family should support family, Ethel. By the end of the first week, I had received similar calls from 5 extended family members, none of whom had shown much interest in my life before. It became clear that my parents were rallying the family against me, presenting themselves as victims of my selfishness, rather than opportunists trying to seize control of my inheritance. The isolation was starting to affect me. My few close friends were supportive but couldn't fully understand the complexity of the situation. "They are still your parents," my friend Danielle said gently after listening to me vent. "Maybe there is a compromise?" Even people who had known my grandparents began to look at me differently. At the grocery store, Mrs. Peterson, who had been in my grandmother's garden club, approached me with concern. "I heard things are difficult with your parents right now," she said. "Your grandmother always worried about family harmony. I am sure she would want you to find peace." It dawned on me that my parents were spreading their narrative throughout the community. Their version: a selfish granddaughter manipulated elderly grandparents into disinheriting their own children, then refused to share the windfall. The pressure intensified when my parents began showing up at my workplace. The first time, my mother appeared in the reception area of the conservation nonprofit where I worked, tearfully telling my colleagues she was worried about my mental state since my grandparents' deaths. My supervisor, Alan, called me into his office afterward. "Family issues should stay at home, Ethel," he said uncomfortably. "We cannot have scenes like that disrupting our work." The second time, my father arrived during a staff meeting, insisting he needed to speak to me immediately about a family emergency. When I stepped outside to speak with him, there was no emergency, only more demands about the inheritance. The constant stress began to affect my sleep, my appetite, my concentration. I felt hunted in my own town, a place that had always been my sanctuary. After my father's workplace ambush, I made a decision. I would temporarily move into my grandparents' house, now my house, to find some peace. The Victorian home had always been my safe haven, filled with warm memories and a sense of belonging. I packed some essentials and drove there after work, feeling a weight lift as I pulled into the familiar driveway. The house was quiet but comforting. I walked through the rooms, running my fingers along the spines of books my grandfather had collected, touching the quilts my grandmother had made. For the first time since their deaths, I felt a sense of their presence, a reminder of what they had wanted for me. That peace lasted exactly 43 hours. I was in the garden, tending to my grandmother's prized roses, when I heard the front door open and close. Thinking it might be Harold Jenkins, who had promised to drop off some paperwork, I headed inside. Instead, I found my parents standing in the living room, looking around as if assessing the property. "How did you get in?" I demanded, my heart racing. My mother held up a key. "We have always had a key, Ethel. This was your grandparents' home, and now it is mine," I said firmly. "You cannot just walk in whenever you want." "Actually," my father said, his voice coldly pleasant, "we wanted to discuss the house specifically. Your grandparents promised years ago that this house would eventually come to us." It was a verbal agreement, but binding nonetheless. I stared at him in disbelief. That contradicts everything in their will and personal letter. People change their minds, especially when influenced by someone living with them, dependent on them, my mother said pointedly. "I was caring for them," I said, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. You were isolating them from their own children during their vulnerable final years, my father countered. A court would find that very interesting. The conversation escalated into the worst confrontation yet. My father produced documents he wanted me to sign, documents that would essentially transfer control of most of the inheritance to my parents. We are prepared to let you keep the house and $2 million, he said, as if offering a generous compromise. The rest returns to its rightful place in the family leadership. When I refused to even look at the papers, my mother's face contorted with rage. "This is our house," she shouted. "Your grandparents promised it to us 2 decades ago. You need to get your things and get out." "I will not leave my own home," I said, standing my ground despite my shaking hands. "Then we will have you removed," my father said coldly, "and file for an emergency injunction freezing the assets until the will can be properly challenged." They left with a final warning. I had 24 hours to come to my senses before they took legal action. As soon as their car pulled away, I called Harold Jenkins in tears, explaining what had happened. "Change the locks immediately," he advised. "They have no legal right to enter your property without permission, regardless of having a key, and do not worry about their threats. The will is airtight." I called a locksmith that afternoon, but the sense of violation remained. My childhood home, the place where I had felt safest, had been invaded by the very people who should have been protecting me. 3 days after changing the locks, I returned from grocery shopping to find an unfamiliar car in my driveway, parked behind my parents' luxury SUV. As I pulled up, I saw that the front door was open, and a woman in a business suit was standing on the porch making notes on a tablet. With a sickening lurch in my stomach, I realized what was happening. I grabbed my phone and began recording as I approached the house. "Excuse me," I called out to the woman. "What are you doing at my home?" She turned, professional smile in place. "Oh, you must be Ethel. I am Brittany Lewis from Pinnacle Realty. Your parents are showing me the property for a potential urgent sale. They mentioned you would be moving out soon." Before I could respond, my father appeared in the doorway. "Ethel, good timing. Brittany is helping us evaluate the house for a quick sale. The market is excellent right now." I stood rooted to the spot, phone still recording. "This is my house. I have not authorized any real estate agents to evaluate it, and it is definitely not for sale." Brittany's smile faltered as she looked between us. "I was told this was a family property with multiple owners agreeing to liquidate." "You were misled," I said firmly. "I am the sole owner of this house, and these people are trespassing. I changed the locks 3 days ago. How did you get in?" My mother appeared behind my father, holding what appeared to be a crowbar. "Robert had to access through the back window," she said defiantly. "We have every right to be here. This house has always been intended for us." Brittany, the realtor, took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Perhaps I should come back when the ownership situation is more clarified," she said, edging toward her car. "There is nothing to clarify," I said loudly, still recording. "I have the deed and the will. This property belongs solely to me." As Brittany hurriedly departed, my parents' facade cracked completely. "You ungrateful little thief," my mother spat. "After everything we have done for you." "Done for me?" I repeated incredulously. "You were barely present in my life. Grandma and Grandpa raised me while you were building your precious careers and image." My father stepped toward me menacingly. "You have until the end of the day to get your things and get out. This is our house now." "I am calling the police," I said, pulling up the phone app. "Go ahead," my mother sneered. "By the time they arrive, we will have documented proof of our long-time connection to this property. Your grandparents promised it to us years ago." As I was dialing, I noticed movement on the street. Mrs. Richmond, my grandparents' next-door neighbor for 30 years, was walking her dog and had stopped to watch the confrontation. Behind her, another neighbor had come out onto his porch, clearly able to hear the shouting. Then, like an answer to a prayer I had not even articulated, a familiar blue sedan pulled up to the curb. Margaret Stewart, my grandmother's best friend since college, emerged and walked briskly toward us. "I thought that was your car, Jennifer," Margaret called to my mother, her voice deceptively pleasant. "What a coincidence. I was just coming to bring Ethel some of Eleanor's favorite rose fertilizer for the garden." She turned to me. "I could hear the commotion from the street, dear. Is everything all right?" "They broke in and are trying to claim the house as theirs," I explained, relief washing over me at seeing a friendly face. "They even brought a real estate agent." Margaret's gentle expression hardened as she turned to my parents. "How interesting. Especially since Eleanor specifically told me, multiple times over the years, that she and William wanted this house to go to Ethel. In fact, we discussed it just 3 weeks before she passed." My father's face reddened. "That is not true. They promised it to us." "Did they put that in writing, Robert?" Margaret asked calmly. "Because I know for a fact they put their actual wishes in writing with Harold Jenkins. I witnessed one of the updates to their will 2 years ago. More neighbors had gathered now, drawn by the commotion. Among them was retired Dr. Philip Blake, who had been my grandparents' physician for decades. "What is going on here?" he asked, approaching our growing group on the lawn. Before anyone could answer, a police car pulled up, responding to my call. 2 officers approached, and I quickly explained the situation. "They broke into my house," I said, pointing to my parents. "I inherited it from my grandparents, changed the locks 3 days ago because they kept entering without permission, and today came home to find they had forced entry and brought a real estate agent to evaluate it for sale." The older officer turned to my parents. "Is this true? Did you force entry into this house?" My father attempted to regain his composure. "Officer, this is a family misunderstanding. My wife and I believe we have a legitimate claim to this property based on verbal promises made by my parents before their deaths." "Do you have documentation of ownership?" the officer asked. "Not yet," my father admitted, "but we are in the process of legally challenging the will." Margaret stepped forward. "Officer, I was a close friend of William and Eleanor Harper for over 50 years. I personally witnessed them update their will to leave everything, including this house, to their granddaughter Ethel. There was no ambiguity about their wishes." Dr. Blake nodded in agreement. "I was their physician, and both William and Eleanor were of completely sound mind when they made their final arrangements. They spoke to me about their decision as well." The younger officer had been inspecting the back of the house and returned to report a damaged window frame where entry had been forced. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper, I need to see some identification," the senior officer said firmly. "Forced entry constitutes breaking and entering, regardless of family relationships." What followed was surreal. My parents were told to leave the property immediately and were warned that charges could be filed. They were made to turn over any keys or other items they had taken from the house. As they prepared to leave, my mother turned to me, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. "This is not over," she hissed. "You have turned our own community against us with your lies." "The only lies here came from you," I replied quietly. "Grandma and Grandpa saw through them years ago." After they drove away, the neighbors lingered, offering support and sharing stories about my grandparents that confirmed what I already knew. They had been beloved, respected members of the community who had made their wishes very clear. When everyone finally left and I was alone in the house again, the enormity of what had happened crashed over me. I sank onto my grandmother's favorite armchair and sobbed, mourning not just my grandparents now, but the idea of who I had thought my parents were. The family I had known was gone forever, replaced by a painful truth I could no longer ignore. The day after the break-in incident, I met with Harold Jenkins to discuss my options. He was outraged at my parents' behavior and immediately helped me file for a restraining order. What they did constitutes breaking and entering, attempted property theft, and harassment, he explained as we completed the paperwork. The restraining order will keep them away from both you and the property, while we address their threats to challenge the will. Sure enough, 3 days later, we received formal notice that my parents had filed a lawsuit, contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and questioning my grandparents' mental capacity during their final years. This is standard procedure in these cases, Harold assured me, but we need to be prepared for an unpleasant battle. I suggest you hire additional counsel who specializes in estate litigation. On his recommendation, I met with attorney Amanda Davis, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with a stellar reputation for handling contested wills. Your case is actually quite strong, Amanda told me, after reviewing the documentation. Your grandparents took exceptional precautions to ensure their wishes would be respected, including psychological evaluations and detailed documentation of their reasoning. Nevertheless, the lawsuit proceeded, and the next few months became a blur of depositions, document discoveries, and legal maneuvering. The process was exhausting and expensive, but Harold had set up an account from my inheritance specifically to cover legal expenses, anticipating potential challenges. During the discovery phase, some shocking information came to light. My parents' financial situation was far worse than they had admitted. They were not just facing $4 million in debts, they had accumulated over $12 million in liabilities through risky investments and lavish spending. More disturbingly, we discovered evidence that they had been pressuring my grandparents for money for years. Emails revealed that my father had requested loans of increasing size, becoming more insistent and less grateful with each transaction. Your grandparents forgave over $3 million in loans to your parents over the past decade, Amanda told me, reviewing the financial records. Yet they continued living beyond their means while expecting more bailouts. We also obtained testimony from my grandparents' doctors, confirming their mental competence until the very end. Dr. Blake provided particularly strong evidence, having performed cognitive assessments on both grandparents just months before they updated their will for the final time. Perhaps most revealing was the discovery of my grandmother's journals. She had kept detailed diaries for decades, and the entries from the last 5 years documented her growing concern about my parents' financial behavior and values. Robert and Jennifer visited today, one entry read. Again, the conversation turned to money within minutes. They see William's lifetime of careful investment as nothing but a potential windfall for their own use. They do not understand that money is merely a tool, not a goal in itself. William and I are increasingly certain that leaving our estate to them would be like pouring water into sand. With Ethel, at least we know the values we cherish will continue. These journals proved invaluable in establishing my grandparents' state of mind and reasoning behind their decision. After 3 grueling months of legal proceedings, the court ordered a mediation attempt before proceeding to trial. My parents, their attorney, Amanda, Harold, and I gathered in a conference room with a court-appointed mediator. My parents looked different somehow, tired and strained, but no less determined. Their attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, presented their generous offer. They would drop the lawsuit if I agreed to give them 70% of the inheritance. This would still leave Miss Harper with over $5 million, a very substantial sum for someone her age, he argued smoothly. And it would honor the implied intentions of the deceased to provide for their immediate family. Amanda did not even look at the written proposal. My client rejects this offer completely, she said firmly. The will explicitly states the decedent's intentions, which were to leave their entire estate to their granddaughter. We have overwhelming evidence supporting both their competence and their reasoning. The mediation collapsed within an hour, and we proceeded to trial the following month. The courthouse was intimidating, all marble and echoing hallways. I wore a conservative blue dress that had belonged to my grandmother, altered slightly to fit me. It felt like bringing a piece of her with me for strength. The trial lasted 4 days, during which both my parents testified, attempting to paint a picture of a loving relationship with my grandparents that had been poisoned by my influence. Their performance might have been convincing to anyone who had not known my grandparents well. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke simply and honestly about my relationship with my grandparents, the values they had taught me, and their clear communications about their wishes. I did not try to vilify my parents. Their own actions spoke louder than any accusations I could make. Dr. Blake, Margaret, and several other community members testified about my grandparents' mental clarity and their frequently expressed intentions regarding their estate. Harold Jenkins provided powerful testimony about the careful, deliberate process my grandparents had followed in creating their will. On the final day, the judge delivered his ruling. The courtroom was silent as he spoke. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony in this matter, I find no grounds to invalidate the will of William and Eleanor Harper. The evidence overwhelmingly indicates they were of sound mind and free from undue influence when they designated their granddaughter, Ethel Harper, as their sole heir. Their detailed letter, explaining their reasoning, further supports the conclusion that this was a carefully considered decision aligned with their values and wishes. He continued, addressing my parents directly. Furthermore, the court finds the plaintiff's claims to be without merit and potentially made in bad faith, given the substantial evidence contradicting their assertions. Therefore, the plaintiffs will be responsible for the defendant's legal costs in this matter. Relief flooded through me as I realized it was over. My grandparents' wishes would be honored, and I could finally begin to move forward. Outside the courthouse, my parents approached me one last time. "This is the biggest mistake of your life," my father said, his voice low and threatening. "You have destroyed this family over money." "No," I replied calmly. "You did that when you decided inheritance was more important than relationship." My mother's face was cold as stone. "Do not contact us again," she said. "As far as we are concerned, we no longer have a daughter." They walked away, and I felt a complex mix of emotions: sadness for what might have been, relief that the battle was over, and a strange sense of freedom. The truth had finally been fully exposed, and while it was painful, it was also clarifying. A week later, I received a letter from my parents. For a moment, I hoped it might contain an apology, or at least an acknowledgement of the harm they had caused. Instead, it was one final manipulation attempt, suggesting that I had been used by Harold Jenkins to steal their inheritance, and that someday I would regret my actions when I needed family support. I did not respond. Some bridges, once burned, cannot and should not be rebuilt. In the months following the court case, I struggled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt vindicated and relieved that my grandparents' wishes had been respected. On the other, I mourned the permanent fracture in my family and battled occasional waves of guilt, wondering if there had been another way. The house felt both comforting and lonely. I would walk through the rooms, touching my grandmother's quilts or my grandfather's books, finding solace in these tangible connections to them, but also feeling the weight of their absence more acutely. Slowly, I began to build a support system. Harold Jenkins became not just my attorney but a mentor, stopping by regularly to check on me and share stories about my grandparents from their decades of friendship. Margaret brought over lunch every Sunday, just as she had done with my grandmother for years. Dr. Blake's wife, Vivian, invited me to join her garden club, which my grandmother had been part of for 30 years. Other neighbors and community members who had known and loved my grandparents reached out in various ways, from bringing casseroles to offering home repair help. 3 months after the trial, on Harold's recommendation, I began seeing a therapist, Dr. Laura Evans, who specialized in family trauma and grief. Our weekly sessions helped me process the complex emotions of losing not only my grandparents, but also the relationship with my parents, complicated by their betrayal. "What you are experiencing is a form of complicated grief," Dr. Evans explained during one session. "You are mourning multiple losses simultaneously: your grandparents, your relationship with your parents, and your understanding of your family narrative." With her help, I began to untangle my feelings of guilt from my commitment to honoring my grandparents' wishes. "You can feel sad about the estrangement without taking responsibility for it," she reminded me. "Your parents made their choices based on their values. You made yours based on different values." As I worked through my grief and confusion, I also had to address the practical matter of managing my inheritance. With Harold's guidance, I assembled a team of ethical financial advisors who understood and respected my priorities. "Your grandmother once told me she hoped their money would allow you to do more good in the world," Harold shared during one of our meetings to discuss investment strategies. "Not to simply accumulate more, but to extend the values they lived by. Taking that to heart, I established the Harper Legacy Foundation, named after my grandparents. The foundation focused on environmental education and conservation efforts in our community, reflecting both my professional background and my grandparents' love of nature. We funded scholarships for students pursuing environmental studies and supported local conservation projects. I also decided to renovate my grandparents' house, carefully preserving its character while updating systems and making it more energy efficient. It was during this renovation that I discovered a hidden letter from my grandmother, tucked inside a hollow book in the library, addressed to me. Unlike the formal letter my grandparents had left with their will, this one was more personal, written in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting on her favorite stationery. My dearest Ethel, if you are reading this, you have likely faced some difficult times following our passing. William and I anticipated that our decision might create conflict. Family dynamics are rarely simple, and money has a way of revealing character rather than building it. Remember that while DNA creates biological family, love and shared values create true family bonds. Some of our dearest friends became our chosen family over the years because they shared our core beliefs about kindness, integrity, and stewardship. Whatever happens, know that you are never truly alone. The community around you holds more support than you might realize. Lean on those connections, and in time, create new ones. The house you now live in has sheltered 5 generations. Make it yours. Change what needs changing, but listen to its stories too. These walls have witnessed much joy and some sorrow, but always resilience. Your path forward is yours to choose. Trust yourself as we trusted you. With endless love, Grandma Eleanor. Finding this letter felt like receiving a hug from beyond, a final gift of wisdom and love that arrived exactly when I needed it most. Around this same time, I reconnected with my cousin Julia, my mother's niece, who had been estranged from the family for years. She reached out after hearing about the court case through mutual acquaintances. Your parents did something similar to my mother years ago, Julia explained when we met for coffee. There was a much smaller inheritance from my grandmother, but they manipulated the situation, so my mother received nothing. When she objected, they cut her off completely. That is why you never saw much of my side of the family growing up. This conversation helped me understand that the patterns I had experienced were long established. It was not personal. It was simply who my parents were, and had always been. Julia and I formed a friendship based on our shared experiences and mutual understanding. Through her, I gained an extended family connection I had never had before. As the months passed, I settled into my new reality. The acute pain of betrayal gradually dulled, replaced by a steady determination to live according to my grandparents' values while forging my own path. I continued my work in environmental conservation, now with the additional resources to make a larger impact. The Harper Legacy Foundation funded the restoration of a local wetland that had been threatened by development, creating both an environmental preserve and an educational center for the community. Occasionally, I would hear news about my parents through mutual connections. They had moved to Arizona, where my father had taken a position with a smaller firm. They apparently still harbored bitterness about the inheritance, telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated my grandparents. But their narrative had lost its power to hurt me. I realized that money does not create character flaws. It merely reveals and magnifies what is already there. My grandparents had understood this fundamental truth and had made their decisions accordingly. 2 years after inheriting my grandparents' estate, I hosted a community gathering in the garden they had loved so much. Friends, neighbors, and even some distant relatives who had reconnected with me attended. We shared stories about Eleanor and William, laughed over old photographs, and celebrated the values they had embodied. Standing in that garden, surrounded by people who had truly known and loved my grandparents, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The inheritance had brought both pain and possibility, but ultimately it had clarified what matters most: integrity, community, and living in alignment with one's deepest values. My grandparents gave me much more than money. They gave me a model for how to live, how to love, and how to navigate difficult choices with grace. That was the true inheritance, one that could never be disputed in court or diminished by others' greed. Have you ever had to stand up for what is right even when it cost you a relationship? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the hardest choices lead us to the most authentic lives. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more journeys of finding strength through difficult family situations. And remember to share with someone who might need to hear that standing in their truth is worth it, even when it is painful. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the courage to honor your own values, whatever challenges you might face.